That child is not mine. The words cracked like a whip in the cold, sterile air of the Reddington Hospital suite. Chief Femi Adebiyi stood with his back to the bed, a titan of industry framed by a panoramic window overlooking the Lekki Ikoyi link bridge. His agbada, a cascade of pristine white lace, was a symbol of his power, a power that could build skyscrapers, sway elections, and, he believed, erase inconvenient truths. "Do you take me for a fool, Ngozi?" he asked, his voice a low growl that vibrated with controlled fury. "Did you truly think a housemaid from some forgotten village could trap me with a bastard child? You thought you could use your body to secure a future your destiny never intended for you?" He didn't look at her. To look at her would be to acknowledge her, and in his world, she was less than a person. She was a problem, a miscalculation to be rectified. He was speaking to dismiss, to diminish, to crush the very hope that had brought her to this point. He was a man who built his empire on the foundation of absolute control, and this child was a crack in that foundation he intended to seal forever. On the bed, Ngozi Eze did not weep. The tears had run dry during the long, lonely nights of her pregnancy. Now there was only a quiet, profound exhaustion, and the fierce, animalistic need to protect the tiny life she held in her arms. She curled her body around her newborn son, a human shield against the storm of her former employer's rage. Her hands, though aching and unsteady, held the baby with a reverence that defied his cruel words. She was 22, but the shame and fear of the past 9 months had aged her spirit. She had once been intimidated by this man, by his wealth, by the sheer force of his presence. But motherhood had forged a new kind of steel within her. She would not beg for herself, but she would fight for her son. "Femi," she whispered, her voice barely audible but cutting through his tirade. "Please, forget me. Forget what you think of me. Just turn around and look at your son, just once. Look into his eyes." The plea was a prayer, a final desperate appeal to the man she once thought she saw beneath the armour of his wealth. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure contempt. "His eyes? You think I care about his eyes? He is nothing to me." Yet, despite his words, a flicker of something, curiosity or perhaps a sliver of doubt, made him turn. His face was a mask of aristocratic indifference, his gaze sweeping over her and the bundle in her arms as if they were a piece of distasteful modern art. Seizing the momentary opening, Ngozi gently shifted the baby. A sliver of the bright Lagos sun pierced through the blinds, illuminating the child's face. As if feeling the warmth, the baby stirred, his tiny eyelids fluttering open for the first time in his father's presence. In that instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the life support machines in the hallway, the distant horns of Lagos traffic, it all faded into a deafening silence. There was only the steady, unblinking gaze of a child who knew nothing of the world, yet carried its most undeniable truth. Femi saw them, the eyes. They were not the deep, dark brown of Ngozi's, nor the common shade of most Nigerians. They were a startling, luminous light brown, with flecks of honey and gold. The Adebiyi eyes. A strangled gasp caught in Femi's throat. His carefully maintained composure disintegrated. He physically stumbled backward, one hand flying to his chest as if to contain a heart that had suddenly rebelled. The Adebiyi eyes were the stuff of legend in Lagos society, a dominant genetic marker that had been the signature of his family for generations. It was the feature praise singers lauded, the feature gossip columnists gushed over, the undeniable stamp of his lineage. In that single devastating moment, he saw the face of his own father, his grandfather, a long line of powerful men, all staring back at him from the face of a maid's child. The walls of his denial crumbled to dust. But just as quickly, his instinct for survival, the ruthless part of him that had built his fortune, kicked in. He shook his head violently as if to ward off a spirit. No, he stammered, his voice losing all its thunder. It's a coincidence. It means nothing. But the lie was hollow even to his own ears. The seed of truth had not just been planted, it had bloomed in an instant, and its roots were already wrapped around his soul. He couldn't breathe. He had to escape. He turned and fled, but not before reaching into his agbada and pulling out a thick manila envelope. He threw it on the bed without looking. "This is the only thing you will ever receive from me," he commanded, his voice strained and thin. "Take it and disappear. If you ever try to contact me again, I will destroy you." He stormed out, his white robes flowing behind him like a flag of surrender. Ngozi ignored the envelope filled with what she knew was blood money. Her gaze was fixed on her son, Kamsi, whose beautiful, burdensome eyes held both his father's history and his own uncertain future. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing the closing of a chapter. But moments later, it swung open again. A nurse rushed in, her face etched with a new and different kind of panic. "Ma," she said, her voice trembling as she clutched a medical file. "The lab. They just called with Kamsi's blood results. It's not about paternity. It's something else, a rare condition they detected. It's urgent." The nurse's words echoed in the sudden ringing silence of the hospital suite. Adebiyi's syndrome, she'd called it, a name spoken with the kind of reverence reserved for royalty or a rare curse. It was, she explained, a benign but dominant hereditary blood marker. It caused no illness, but was a genetic fingerprint, a signature found exclusively in Chief Femi Adebiyi's paternal bloodline and documented in private medical journals for generations. The implication was a crushing weight. Should Kamsi ever need a blood transfusion, only a direct relative from that same lineage could provide a perfect match. The man who had denied him with his words was irrevocably bound to him by his very blood. The nurse, sensing the gravity of the moment, placed a small clinical folder on the bedside table. "For the boy's records, Ma, it's critical we have the father's medical history." With a look of profound pity, she quietly exited, leaving Ngozi in a world that had tilted entirely off its axis. The envelope of money lay on the crisp white sheets, a pathetic and useless insult. This new truth was not a weapon for vengeance. It was a map for her son's survival, and every road led back to Femi. She lifted her son, whom she had already named Kamsi, as God wills, and held his warm, fragile body against her own. The sterile room seemed to fade away, the scent of antiseptic replaced by the memory of another place, another time, before the storm had broken. Her mind retreated 2 years, to the humid afternoon she first walked through the imposing gates of the Adebiyi estate in Banana Island. It was less a home and more a monument to success, a sprawling palace of white marble and glass that seemed to float above the Lagos lagoon. She had arrived from her village with a small bag and a heart full of desperate hope, determined to earn enough to care for her ailing mother. Her first lesson was the law of invisibility. The staff were expected to be ghosts, silent and efficient, erasing any evidence of their own existence. Dust, fingerprints, and misplaced cushions were treated as personal failings. The silence of the estate was the second lesson. It was a deep, echoing quiet that the vast wealth within its walls seemed only to amplify. It was the sound of a profound and magnificent loneliness. Chief Femi Adebiyi was the king of this silent kingdom. In those first months, Ngozi observed him from the periphery, a figure of immense power who moved through his own life with a detached, almost sorrowful grace. He was not cruel to the staff. He simply did not see them. His orders were filtered through a stern head housekeeper, Mrs. Bello, but his preferences were law. He liked his coffee brewed with single-origin beans at exactly 92 degrees Celsius, his shoes polished until they reflected the sky, his study kept at a constant cool temperature that always made Ngozi shiver. She would watch him sometimes, a solitary figure on the expansive terrace, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his phone as he commanded his global empire. He was surrounded by opulence, priceless art, designer furniture, a fleet of luxury cars, but he was utterly alone. Ngozi, who had grown up in a small house brimming with the noise and warmth of family, saw his loneliness as a kind of poverty, a deep spiritual emptiness that all his billions could not fill. It was a vulnerability she never expected to find in a man so powerful. The night that shattered the silence was the night of the Adebiyi Foundation's annual charity gala. The estate was transformed into a glittering spectacle of Lagos high society. Politicians, oil magnates, and Nollywood royalty dripped with diamonds and privilege, their laughter echoing through the grand ballroom. Ngozi, in her simple black uniform, navigated the sea of power, her face an impassive mask as she offered champagne and canapes. She watched Femi work the room, his smile perfectly crafted, his handshake firm, his amber eyes revealing nothing. He was playing a role, the magnanimous host, and he played it flawlessly. But as the night wore on, Ngozi saw the mask begin to slip. Long after the last Bentley had purred away, she found him in his private study. He was slumped in a leather armchair, a bottle of ludicrously expensive cognac on the table beside him. His grand agbada was unbuttoned, and the formidable chief had vanished, leaving behind a man lost in the echoing quiet of his own life. The carefully constructed performance was over, and what remained was raw, unguarded, and dangerously real. He didn't dismiss her with his usual curt wave. Instead, he watched her as she moved silently, collecting empty glasses. His famous eyes, usually so sharp and commanding, were clouded with alcohol and a deep, aching sadness. "Stop," he said, his voice a low slur. She froze, a tray in her hands. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit." It was not a command, but a plea. Hesitantly, she did. "They all want something," he murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "My money, my name, a contract, a favour. It never stops." He finally looked at her, and his gaze was so intense it felt as if he were seeing her for the first time. "But you're different. You move through this house and you don't ask for anything, you just watch." He leaned forward, the scent of cognac and his expensive cologne filling the space between them. "Tell me, Ngozi," he whispered, his voice thick with a vulnerability that stripped her of all her defences. "What do you see when you watch me?" The question was a key, unlocking a door she never should have walked through, and in her foolish, youthful pity, she stepped inside. "I see a man who has everything but is happy with nothing," Ngozi replied, her voice barely a whisper. The words left her lips before she could stop them, a truth so raw and audacious it hung in the air between them like a held breath. She expected him to erupt in anger, to fire her on the spot for her insolence. Instead, Femi let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "The Maid sees more than my board of directors," he murmured, staring into his glass. "You're right. I have built an empire, but I live in a mausoleum, a beautiful empty tomb." He spoke of his success as a prison, each new acquisition another gold bar on his cage. He confessed the immense pressure of his family name, the ghost of his demanding father who saw love as weakness, and the parade of women who saw him only as a walking, talking bank vault. He spoke of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical illness, a cold that no amount of wealth could warm. As he spoke, the formidable Chief Femi Adebiyi dissolved, and in his place was a profoundly broken man. Ngozi listened, her heart aching with a dangerous, forbidden empathy. She had been raised to believe that pity was a form of respect, an acknowledgement of another's suffering. She did not understand then that for a man like Femi, pity from a woman like her could be mistaken for something else entirely. When he fell silent, his shoulders slumped in defeat, she did something simple and human. She reached across the small table and placed her hand gently on his. "You are not alone," she said softly. The touch was not meant to be seductive. It was meant to be kind. But in the whiskey-soaked intimacy of the late hour, the line between the two blurred. His head snapped up, his amber eyes locking onto hers, and in them she saw not just sadness, but a desperate, starving hunger for connection. He stood, pulling her to her feet, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Don't leave," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Just for tonight. Stay. Remind me what it feels like to have another soul in this empty house." And Ngozi, moved by his raw pain and her own naive desire to heal a wound so deep, did not pull away. It was a mistake born not of ambition, but of a compassion she could not control. The next morning she awoke in a guest room she had cleaned 100 times before, the sheets feeling alien and wrong against her skin. The sun was streaming through the windows, and the cold, harsh light of day brought with it an immediate and suffocating shame. Femi was gone. There was no note, no word, only the lingering scent of his cologne on the pillow beside her. She dressed quickly, her hands shaking, and slipped out of the room, praying no one would see her. But as she hurried down the long, silent corridor, she was intercepted by Mrs. Bello, the head housekeeper. The older woman's face was a stony mask, her eyes cold and accusing. "Chief Adebiyi has instructed me to inform you that your services are no longer required," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "He has been very generous." She held out a thick envelope. It was not a severance package. It was a dismissal, a clear and brutal message. What had felt like a moment of shared, fragile humanity to Ngozi had been, to him, a transaction. A problem to be paid off and discarded. The pity she had felt for him curdled into a hot, bitter humiliation. She took the envelope without a word, her pride refusing to let Mrs. Bello see her cry. She packed her few belongings in a haze of disbelief, the echoing silence of the estate now feeling menacing, mocking her foolishness. As she was escorted to the gate by a security guard, she clutched the envelope in her hand. She hadn't opened it, but she could feel the thick stack of notes inside. It felt heavy, dirty. It was the price of her compassion, the cost of her mistake. She did not know, as she stepped out onto the humid Lagos street, that she carried something else away from that house, something far more permanent than a bundle of cash. Weeks later, in the cramped, stuffy room she rented in a crowded part of the mainland, 2 faint pink lines on a cheap pregnancy test confirmed it. The night that Femi saw as a regrettable lapse in judgment, a problem to be solved with money, had created a life. A life that would carry his name in its blood and his legacy in its eyes, whether he wanted it to or not. The true price of that night was not in the envelope. It was growing silently within her. The next 9 months were a lonely, terrifying blur. Ngozi told no one. Her shame was a heavy cloak she wore constantly. How could she explain to her devout mother that she was pregnant for a man who didn't even know her name, a man who had paid her to disappear? She used the money Femi had given her to survive, hoarding every naira, terrified of the future. The memory of his vulnerability in the study warred with the cold brutality of his dismissal. Had any of it been real, or had she just been a convenience? As her body changed, a new resolve began to form within her, a strength she didn't know she possessed. This was not a mistake. This was her child. When the first pains of labour seized her, she used the last of the money to get a taxi to the best hospital she could afford. She gave the nurses his name not as an accusation, but as a medical necessity. She never expected him to come. His arrival was a shock, but his denial was a confirmation of the truth she had tried to avoid. To him, she and her child were nothing but a stain on his perfect, polished life. A stain he was determined to bleach away. Armed with 2 irrefutable truths, the luminous Adebiyi eyes and the damning certainty of Adebiyi's syndrome. Ngozi walked out of the hospital and into a new, terrifying chapter of her life. She left the envelope of blood money untouched on the sterile bedside table, a silent act of defiance. She would not allow her son's story to begin with a payoff. She took a bus not to her old, cramped room, but to a different part of Lagos, to Surulere, where the constant thrum of life felt like a promise of anonymity. She found a small single room in a face me, I face you compound, a world of shared kitchens, shared bathrooms, and shared struggles. It was a universe away from the silent marble halls of Banana Island, but it was real. The air was thick with the smells of frying plantain and the sounds of children's laughter and neighbours' arguments. Here she was not a disgraced maid. She was just another young mother trying to survive. Her son, Kamsi, was her entire world, his. Innocent, amber-flecked eyes, a constant reminder of both her pain and her purpose. She loved him with a ferocity that left no room for self-pity. The first few months were the hardest. Money was a constant worry. She found a grueling job washing dishes in the back of a bustling buka, her hands raw and aching by the end of each day. She would strap Kamsi to her back while she worked, the heat of the kitchen making him fussy and slick with sweat. The other women in the compound whispered. They saw a young unmarried mother with a baby whose eyes were a different colour from her own, and they drew their own conclusions. The whispers followed her to the market, to the shared tap in the yard. "Who is the father?" they would murmur, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and judgment. She must have been with an Oyimbo. Ngozi learned to hold her head high, to meet their stares with a quiet dignity that offered no explanation. Her story was her own, and she would not let it become fodder for compound gossip. Her silence was a shield, protecting the fragile world she was building for her son. It was a world built not on wealth or a powerful name, but on the simple, unshakable foundation of a mother's love. In the bustling chaos of the Tejusho market, where she bought Kamsi's food, Ngozi found an unlikely ally. Mama Chioma was a formidable woman in her late 50s who sold fabrics from a stall overflowing with vibrant ankara and lace. She had a loud laugh, a sharp tongue, and eyes that saw everything. She noticed Ngozi from the start, the proud set of her jaw, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the beautiful, unusual baby she always carried. One afternoon, as Ngozi was haggling over the price of yams, 2 other market women began whispering loudly about her. Mama Chioma rounded on them like a lioness. "Is it your husband that she stole?" she boomed, her voice silencing the entire row of stalls. "Is it your money she is spending? Or is your own life so empty that you must feast on the struggles of this child? Leave her alone." From that day on, Mama Chioma took Ngozi under her wing. She would hold Kamsi while Ngozi shopped, slipping extra vegetables into her bag and offering gruff, practical advice. She never asked about the baby's father. She didn't need to. She saw the truth in Ngozi's quiet strength. Mama Chioma and a small circle of other market women became Ngozi's family. They were women who understood hardship, who knew the weight of survival. They taught her how to navigate the complex social codes of the compound, how to stretch 1,000 naira to last a week, and, most importantly, they reminded her that she was not alone. They celebrated Kamsi's small milestones, his first tooth, his first word, with a joy that was pure and genuine. They did not see a scandal. They saw a mother and her child. In this small community of resilient women, Ngozi began to heal. The shame that had clung to her since she left the Adebiyi estate began to loosen its grip. She was not defined by Femi's rejection or the whispers of strangers. She was Kamsi's mother, a woman of strength and dignity. She still thought of Femi, not with longing, but with a distant, sorrowful pity. He was a king in a cold castle, while she, in her single humble room, was richer than he could ever imagine. She had Kamsi. She had love. She had a life. One sunny Sunday afternoon, the small church Ngozi attended held its annual harvest festival in the churchyard. It was a joyous, noisy affair filled with music, dancing, and tables laden with food. Mama Chioma insisted on dressing Kamsi in a tiny, impeccably tailored Ankara outfit made from a fabric remnant from her stall. Kamsi, now a beautiful, babbling 8-month-old, was the centre of attention, his luminous eyes charming everyone he met. A young photographer from a local newspaper covering the festival was captivated by him. "Please, can I take his picture?" he asked Ngozi. "He is so handsome." Flushed with pride, Ngozi agreed. The photographer snapped a few photos of Kamsi sitting on a colourful mat, laughing as he reached for a balloon. It was a simple, innocent moment of happiness. Ngozi thought nothing more of it. She had no way of knowing that the shutter's click was the sound of her carefully constructed shield beginning to crack, or that this one innocent photograph published in the society pages of a minor newspaper was about to find its way onto the screen of the one man in the world she was determined to forget. If you are enjoying this story, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from right now. Have you ever seen a situation like this unfold? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. The photograph was not on the front page. It was a small human interest picture buried deep within the society section of the Lagos Guardian, part of a colourful spread on community events. The caption was simple: "A young boy enjoys the festivities at the All Saints Church Harvest Festival in Surulere." Kamsi's name wasn't mentioned, neither was Ngozi's. He was just an anonymous, beautiful child. But in Lagos, a city that thrives on whispers and connections, anonymity is an illusion. A bored socialite, idly scrolling through the online edition of the paper, was the first to see it. She recognized the eyes. She had seen them across a dinner table at a polo match, glaring from the cover of Forbes Africa. She took a screenshot and sent it to a friend with a single explosive question. "Don't these look like the Adebiyi eyes?" Within an hour, the photograph was circulating in the rarefied air of Lagos's elite WhatsApp groups. By noon, it had been picked up by a notorious gossip blogger known for her sharp wit and merciless takedowns. The blog post was titled "Chief Femi Adebiyi's Secret Son," or "Just a Coincidence." The post went viral. The blogger didn't make any direct accusations. She simply placed Kamsi's photo next to a well-known society picture of Femi, inviting her millions of followers to spot the difference. The comments section erupted. Hundreds, then thousands of people weighed in. "It's the eyes! Unmistakable," one wrote. "That man has children scattered all over," another claimed. "It's probably a Photoshop. People are just jealous of his success," a defender argued. The photograph, stripped of its innocent context, became a subject of fierce public debate. Ngozi's quiet life in Surulere was over. She just didn't know it yet. The digital storm was raging miles away, in a world of fibre optic cables and glass towers, but its thunder was rolling steadily and surely toward her humble doorstep. For the first time since Kamsi's birth, the secret was no longer hers to keep. It belonged to the internet now, and the internet was a beast that could not be controlled. The news reached Femi in the middle of a tense board meeting. His company was finalizing a multi-billion naira merger, and every detail was critical. His personal assistant, a perpetually nervous young man named David, broke protocol and slipped into the room, placing a tablet on the polished mahogany table in front of Femi. On the screen was the blog post. Femi's blood ran cold. He saw Kamsi's laughing face, those luminous, honey-gold eyes staring out at him. It was the same photo but seen through the lens of public speculation. It was no longer just a picture, it was an accusation. He felt the gazes of his board members on him, felt the sudden uncomfortable shift in the room's atmosphere. He calmly slid the tablet back to his assistant. "A ridiculous fabrication," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the suddenly turbulent waters. "Continue with the presentation." He projected an aura of unshakable calm, but inside a violent storm was raging. The ghost he thought he had banished with an envelope of cash had returned, not as a whisper, but as a headline. He endured the rest of the meeting in a state of controlled fury. As soon as it was over, he retreated to the sanctuary of his office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of a city that suddenly felt hostile. He pulled up the blog post again, scrolling through the comments, each one a small, sharp stab at his carefully curated reputation. He was not a man who tolerated loose ends. He had built his empire by identifying and neutralizing threats before they could grow. But this was different. This was not a business rival or a market fluctuation. This was a child. His child. The memory of the hospital, the baby's eyes, the nurse's urgent warning about his blood, came rushing back. He had tried to bury it, to file it away as a moment of weakness, but the past refused to stay buried. His first instinct was to crush the source. He would find the blogger, the newspaper, and sue them into oblivion. He would make an example of them, a warning to anyone who dared to tarnish the Adebiyi name. But as he stared at Kamsi's face, a different, more unsettling thought took hold. A lawsuit would only add fuel to the fire. It would be an admission of sorts, a sign that the rumor had hit a nerve. No, this required a more delicate touch. He had to silence the source. He had to silence Ngozi. He summoned his lawyer, Barrister Cole, a man renowned for his ruthlessness and his ability to make problems disappear. "Find her," Femi commanded, his voice like ice. "Find the woman Ngozi Eze. She is living somewhere in Surulere. Go to her. Offer her a settlement, a life-changing amount of money. In exchange, she will sign a non-disclosure agreement and deny these rumors publicly. If she refuses—" Femi paused, his amber eyes hardening. "Then you will remind her what happens to people who stand in my way. Make her understand the consequences of her foolishness." Barrister Cole simply nodded, a thin, predatory smile on his lips. He was a man who enjoyed his work. As the lawyer left, Femi turned back to the window, watching the endless flow of traffic below. He was confident. Money and fear had always worked before. They would work again. Barrister Cole moved with the swift, silent precision of a predator. Within a day, he had located Ngozi. He didn't come to her compound in a flashy car that would attract attention. Instead, he arrived on foot one evening, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored suit, looking more like a missionary than a corporate executioner. He found Ngozi in the shared courtyard, washing Kamsi's clothes in a plastic basin. When he introduced himself as Chief Femi Adebiyi's legal counsel, a cold dread washed over her. He was polite, his voice smooth and professional, but his eyes were cold and empty. He didn't issue threats. He laid out a future. He spoke of a generous trust fund for the child, a new, fully furnished apartment in a quiet part of Lekki, a lifetime of financial security. "All Chief Adebiyi asks," the lawyer said, his voice like silk, "is for this unfortunate rumor to be put to rest. You will release a simple statement, drafted by us, stating that the resemblance is a coincidence and that you have no connection to the chief." He made it sound so reasonable, so logical. It was a golden door opening before her, a path out of her daily struggle. Ngozi listened in silence, her hands still submerged in the soapy water. She looked from the lawyer's expensive leather shoes to Kamsi, who was sleeping peacefully on a mat nearby. The lawyer's offer was a temptation, a devil's bargain. He was offering her everything she thought she wanted: security, comfort, an end to her worries. But the price was her son's truth. The price was to look into those luminous amber eyes every day for the rest of her life and know that she had sold his identity for a life of ease. The price was to participate in the very lie that had caused her so much pain. When the lawyer finished, she slowly dried her hands on her wrapper and looked him directly in the eye. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. Barrister Cole's polite facade flickered. "I don't think you understand, Miss Ease. This is a very generous, one-time offer." "I understand perfectly," Ngozi replied, her voice gaining strength. "Your offer is generous, but my son's truth is not for sale. Please leave." Her refusal was not angry or dramatic. It was calm, resolute, and utterly immovable. The lawyer's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold annoyance. The silk in his voice was gone, replaced by steel. "You are making a grave mistake," he warned. "Chief Adebiyi is a powerful man. He can be a generous friend or a formidable enemy. Do you really want to make an enemy of him? Think of your son. A life of struggle, of whispers, of being known as the bastard child of a liar. Or a life of privilege. The choice is yours, but you will only get to make it once." He let the threat hang in the air, a poisonous cloud. But Ngozi did not waver. The fear she had lived with for months had been replaced by something stronger, a mother's conviction. "I am thinking of my son," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And he deserves a mother who values truth more than money. Now I will ask you again. Please leave my home." Defeated and visibly irritated, Barrister Cole turned and walked away, his mission a failure. Ngozi watched him go, her heart pounding but her spirits soaring. She had faced the lion's messenger and had not backed down. The lawyer's report to Femi was blunt. She refused. Completely. Money means nothing to her. Femi was incredulous. In his life, he had never encountered a problem that could not be solved by a checkbook or a threat. He had bought companies, politicians, and loyalties. The idea that this poor, insignificant housemaid could possess something he could not buy, a conviction, was both infuriating and deeply unsettling. It was a crack in his understanding of the world. Barrister Cole suggested they move to the next phase, a campaign of quiet intimidation. Make her life difficult, get her fired from her job, pressure her landlord, make her struggle so unbearable that she would have no choice but to accept his offer. Femi initially agreed, his anger clouding his judgment. But later that night, as he sat alone in his vast, silent study, he found himself thinking not of the defiant woman, but of the child. He remembered the feel of Kamsi's tiny body in his arms at the hospital, the innocent, trusting gaze from those all-too-familiar eyes. He pulled up the blog post again and stared at the photograph. He saw the joy on the child's face, a pure, unblemished happiness. His lawyer's plan was to systematically destroy the life of this child's mother, to plunge them into deeper poverty and despair, all to protect his own reputation. A wave of self-loathing washed over him, so intense it was dizzying. What kind of man had he become? Was his legacy so fragile that it had to be built on the suffering of a woman he had wronged and the denial of his own son? For the first time, the cold logic of his world seemed like a form of madness. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer. "Stop everything," he commanded. "Do not touch her. Do not go near her again. I will handle this myself." Barrister Cole was stunned into silence. Femi hung up before he could argue. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but he knew what he was not going to do. He would not become the monster his lawyer wanted him to be. He would not destroy her. He would face her. The decision to go to Surulere himself felt like an act of madness. It violated every rule Femi lived by. He never involved himself in messy personal conflicts. He paid people like Barrister Cole to handle them. He never ventured into the chaotic, vibrant heart of the mainland. He observed it from the climate-controlled comfort of his car on the way to the airport. But the image of Kamsi's face and the quiet, unshakable dignity of Ngozi's refusal had lodged themselves deep in his psyche. He needed to see them for himself, away from the distorting lens of lawyers and gossip blogs. He needed to confront the reality he had been running from. One afternoon, without telling his security or his staff, he took one of his less conspicuous cars and drove himself off the island. Crossing the third mainland bridge felt like crossing into another country. The manicured lawns and serene quiet of Banana Island gave way to a riot of colour, sound, and humanity. It was overwhelming, real, and terrifying. He felt like a foreigner in his own city, a king stripped of his robes and cast out of his castle. He found Ngozi's compound easily enough. It was a modest, slightly worn building, but clean, with pots of flowers on the balconies. He parked down the street and sat in his car for a long time, watching children play football in the dusty road, their shouts and laughter filling the air. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name, a longing for this simple, uncomplicated joy. Finally, he gathered his courage and walked to the gate. He knocked, his heart pounding a nervous, unfamiliar rhythm. When Ngozi opened the door, her eyes widened in a mixture of shock and fear. She was dressed in a simple wrapper, her hair tied back, and she was even more beautiful than he remembered. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight, her body instinctively blocking the entrance to her room. "I came to talk," he said, the words feeling inadequate and foolish. "Your lawyer already talked," she retorted, her chin high. "He made your position very clear." "He no longer speaks for me," Femi said. "This is between you and me. Please, Ngozi." 5 minutes. She hesitated, her eyes darting from his face to the street behind him, wary of the attention his presence would attract. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, she stepped aside and let him in. The room was small and sparse, but clean and filled with a warmth that his mansion completely lacked. A small mat on the floor, a single bed in the corner, a cooking pot on a kerosene stove. And in the centre of the room, sitting on the mat and playing with a set of wooden blocks, was Kamsi. The boy looked up as Femi entered, his playing momentarily forgotten. Their eyes met across the small room. The same luminous honey-gold gaze, one filled with the wisdom of power and pain, the other with the pure, unfiltered curiosity of a child. The sight of his son, healthy and real, and so undeniably his, was a physical blow. Every rationalization, every denial he had ever constructed evaporated in the face of this simple, profound truth. Kamsi was not a rumor or a problem to be managed. He was a living, breathing person. He was his son. Femi stood frozen, unable to speak, his throat tight with a lifetime of unexpressed emotion. Ngozi watched him, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of defiance and a strange, wary sympathy. She saw the shock on his face, the crumbling of his arrogance. Kamsi, unafraid, let out a happy gurgle and went back to his blocks, occasionally glancing up at the strange, tall man who had entered his world. "You came here to threaten me again?" Ngozi finally asked, breaking the silence. "You came to see if my poverty would make me change my mind?" Femi could only shake his head, his gaze still locked on the child. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I came to see." "And what do you see?" she pressed, her voice hard, demanding an answer. He finally tore his eyes away from Kamsi and looked at her, his own eyes filled with a new and terrifying vulnerability. "I see," he started, but couldn't finish. He saw his legacy, his shame, his redemption, and his greatest fear, all sitting on a worn mat, playing with wooden blocks. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his retreat as abrupt and confusing as his arrival. He didn't offer money. He didn't issue threats. He simply left, leaving Ngozi standing in her small room, more bewildered than ever. She had prepared for a fight, for a storm, but all she got was a deafening silence. As he drove back to the island, his hands gripping the steering wheel, Femi felt his entire world tilting. The problem was no longer how to silence Ngozi Eze. The problem was how to live with the truth he had just seen with his own eyes. The child was his. The fact was as solid and real as the concrete bridge beneath his tires. He could no longer deny it, not even to himself. The war was over. But as he looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror, he knew a new, more difficult battle was just beginning. The battle with himself. And he had no idea if it was a battle he could win. The story of Chief Femi Adebiyi's visit to a Face Me, I Face You in Surulere spread through Lagos like wildfire. A neighbour had snapped a blurry photo of his car, another had seen him at the gate. By the next morning, the gossip blogs had a new explosive headline: Billionaire Chief Adebiyi visits mystery baby mama's home. Ngozi's carefully guarded anonymity was shattered. Her life became a public spectacle. News vans and reporters camped outside her compound, their long-lens cameras pointed at her door like weapons. They ambushed her on her way to the market, shouting intrusive questions. "Is he your son, Chief? Are you demanding a settlement? Why did you hide him for so long?" The attention was terrifying and suffocating. She felt like an animal in a zoo, her private pain displayed for public consumption. The whispers in her compound turned into open stares. She was no longer just Ngozi, the quiet young mother. She was now a character in a national drama. The pressure was immense and it began to take its toll. The owner of the buka where she worked fired her. "I'm sorry, Ngozi," he said, his eyes full of pity. "But the reporters are scaring away my customers. I can't have this kind of trouble here." Ngozi didn't blame him. She understood. But the loss of her small income was a devastating blow. The world was closing in on her, and she felt her strength beginning to fray. Mama Chioma and the other market women rallied around her, bringing her food and shielding her from the most aggressive reporters. But they couldn't stop the tide. Meanwhile, Femi's world was also in chaos. The story was no longer a fringe gossip item. It was front-page news. His company's stock took a noticeable dip. His family, a proud and powerful dynasty, was in an uproar, demanding he put an end to the disgraceful circus. His investors were calling emergency meetings, worried about the stability of his leadership. The man who prided himself on control had lost it completely. Every aspect of his life was now being dictated by a story he had tried, and failed, to bury. He holed himself up in his office, ignoring the barrage of calls. He was trapped between two impossible choices. His lawyers, his family, and his business partners were all urging him to launch an aggressive counterattack. "We must discredit her," Barrister Cole, whom he had reluctantly rehired, argued forcefully. "We paint her as an obsessed, unstable gold digger. We leak stories about her past. We create enough doubt that the public doesn't know what to believe. We control the narrative." It was the logical, ruthless path. It was the path his father would have taken. It was the Adebiyi way. But Femi kept seeing Kamsi's face, kept hearing his innocent gurgle as he played with his blocks. To authorize a smear campaign would be to declare war on his own son's mother. It would mean deliberately and maliciously destroying her reputation, all to save his own. It was a monstrous act, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he was capable of it. Ngozi, feeling cornered and desperate, remembered the medical folder the nurse had given her. The proof of Kamsi's hereditary blood condition. It was the ultimate trump card. She could leak it to the press and end the debate forever. It would destroy Femi's denials and force him to acknowledge his son. Mama Chioma advised against it. "Vengeance is a bitter soup, my child," she warned. "Don't let them turn you into something you are not. Hold on to your truth, but do not use it as a weapon." Ngozi knew she was right. She could not stoop to Femi's level. She put the folder away, deciding to place her faith not in documents or media battles, but in the simple, unshakable truth of her son's existence. She would weather the storm with her dignity intact. Her strength was not in her ability to fight back, but in her refusal to be broken. She would endure. For Kamsi, she would endure. Back in his glass tower, Femi made his decision. It was a choice that stunned his entire team. He would not authorize a smear campaign. He would not try to destroy Ngozi. Instead, he would take a different path, a gamble that could either save him or ruin him completely. He instructed Barrister Cole to file a court petition and release a public statement. The statement was masterful in its ambiguity. It stated that in order to put an end to the malicious and unfounded rumours that were causing distress to all parties, Chief Adebiyi was formally requesting a court-ordered DNA test to conclusively prove the truth and clear his name once and for all. It was a power move, an attempt to seize control of the narrative, framing him as a man seeking truth rather than running from it. But it was also a step into the abyss. By demanding the test, he was setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to an undeniable scientific verdict. The truth, one way or another, was coming. What would you have done if you were in Ngozi's position? Would you have leaked the medical report? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story is touching your heart, please give it a like and share it with your friends. The news of the court-ordered DNA test exploded across the media landscape. It was the perfect dramatic escalation. Chief Femi Adebiyi, the powerful billionaire, was no longer just denying a rumour. He was challenging his accuser to a modern-day duel, to be fought not with swords, but with science. The public was captivated. To his supporters, it was a bold move, the act of an innocent man confident of his vindication. To his detractors, it was a desperate public relations stunt, a final attempt to control a story that had spiraled beyond his grasp. For Ngozi, the legal papers delivered to her door by a solemn court official were both a threat and a relief. It was another attempt by Femi to intimidate her, to drag her into his world of lawyers and legal battles. But it was also the one thing she had secretly prayed for, a path to an undeniable, irrefutable truth. She accepted the summons with a steady hand. "Tell the court I will be there," she said, her voice clear and firm. She would not hide. She had nothing to hide. The day of the appointment at the forensic clinic was a media circus. Reporters, photographers, and television crews formed a chaotic mob at the entrance, a wall of shouting voices and flashing lights. Mama Chioma and a few of the other market women formed a protective circle around Ngozi and Kamsi as they made their way through the crowd. Ngozi kept her head held high, her face a calm mask, her focus entirely on shielding her son from the pandemonium. She was dressed simply, in a clean, modest gown, a stark contrast to the drama swirling around her. She was not playing a role. She was simply a mother, there to affirm her son's identity. The world could scream and flash and judge, but in her heart, there was a quiet, steady peace. She knew the truth. Soon the rest of the world would too. She was not there to fight a battle. She was there to witness a victory that had been won the moment Kamsi was born. Femi arrived through a private rear entrance, flanked by his lawyer and 2 imposing bodyguards. He looked tired, the strain of the past few weeks visible in the tense set of his jaw and the shadows under his eyes. The arrogant, untouchable chief was gone, replaced by a man bracing for impact. When he entered the sterile, white waiting room, a heavy silence fell. His gaze immediately found Ngozi, who was sitting in a corner gently rocking Kamsi in her arms. Their eyes met across the room, and for a long moment, the world outside, with its cameras and shouting, ceased to exist. There was only the 2 of them, the man and the woman whose lives had been irrevocably tangled by one night of loneliness and pity. Kamsi, sensing the tension, stirred in his mother's arms and turned his head. His luminous, light brown eyes, so clear and innocent, fixed on his father. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken history. In that instant, every defense Femi had ever built, every cruel word he had ever spoken, every lie he had ever told himself, crumbled to dust. The resemblance was not just striking, it was absolute. It was like looking at a photograph of himself as a baby. The child was his. It was a truth so profound, so self-evident that the need for a scientific test seemed absurd. He felt a wave of shame so powerful it almost buckled his knees. This child, his son, had been treated as an inconvenience, a scandal, a lie. He had let his pride and his fear turn him into a monster. A nurse called their names, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silent room. The procedure itself was quick and clinical. A soft swab inside Kamsi's cheek, which made him giggle. Another swab from Femi. The samples were sealed, labelled, and taken away. But the act itself felt monumental. With each sealed vial, the wall around Femi's denial was being dismantled, brick by brick, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Afterward, as they prepared to leave, through their separate exits, their paths crossed briefly in the corridor. For the first time since that fateful night in his study, they were truly alone, away from the eyes of lawyers, reporters, and family. He stopped, unable to walk away. "Ngozi," he began, his voice hoarse. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt too small, too pathetic for the magnitude of his wrongdoing. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't offer anger or forgiveness. She just waited. He couldn't find the words. He only looked at Kamsi one last time, his gaze filled with a lifetime of regret, before turning and walking away. As Ngozi stepped back out into the blinding flashbulbs, she knew something had shifted. The DNA test was just a formality now. The true test had already happened, in the silent, sterile rooms of the clinic, and Femi Adebiyi had failed it completely. The results would arrive in a week, but the verdict was already in. The week of waiting was a strange, suspended time. The media held its breath, and a temporary tense quiet settled over Ngozi's life. For Femi, it was a week of reckoning. He cancelled all his meetings, ignored all his calls, and locked himself away in his Banana Island estate. The silence he had once curated as a symbol of his power now felt like a suffocating prison. He wandered through the vast, empty rooms, haunted by the image of Kamsi's face. He had spent his life accumulating things, companies, properties, art, all in an effort to fill the void his loveless childhood had left him. He had succeeded in building an empire, but he had failed at the one thing that mattered, being a good man. The DNA results, he knew, would not just be a confirmation of paternity, they would be a judgment on his character, a public unveiling of his moral bankruptcy. He drank, not for pleasure, but for oblivion. But even the most expensive cognac could not silence the truth that was screaming in his soul. The child was his, and he had denied him. It was a sin he feared was too great to be forgiven. The envelope arrived at Ngozi's door on a Tuesday morning. It was delivered by the same solemn court official, its contents holding the power to redefine her entire world. Her hands trembled as she signed for it. She took it inside and sat at her small table, Kamsi playing at her feet. For a long moment she just stared at the official seal, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The end of the whispers, the end of the doubt. She took a deep breath and carefully tore it open. The language was cold and scientific, a series of genetic markers and statistical probabilities. But her eyes scanned the page until they found the final conclusive sentence. The probability of paternity is 99.999%. A single hot tear escaped her eye and splashed onto the page. It was a tear of relief, of vindication, of a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. It was over. She leaned her head back and let out a shuddering breath. "They know now, my love," she whispered to Kamsi, who looked up at her and smiled. "The whole world knows you are not a lie." By noon, the story had leaked. It was the lead item on every news channel, the top trending topic on every social media platform. The headlines were sensational. "DNA proves it. Chief Adebiyi is the father." The photograph of Kamsi's luminous eyes was everywhere, now presented as Exhibit A in the case against the billionaire's denial. The public verdict was swift and brutal. Femi was no longer seen as a powerful man defending his name, but as a cruel and arrogant liar who had publicly shamed the mother of his child. His empire, which had been wavering, began to crumble in earnest. Key investors, spooked by the scandal and his now toxic reputation, began to pull out. His company's stock plummeted. His family, who had once demanded he crush the rumour, now disavowed him for letting it be proven true. He was utterly, completely alone, shipwrecked on an island of his own making. The calls from his lawyer were frantic. "We need to issue a statement. We need to start settlement talks. We need to do damage control." But Femi did not answer. He was in his study, the same room where he had sealed his fate with Ngozi, staring at a portrait of his late father. The man in the painting was stern and unforgiving, his eyes, the same amber-flecked eyes Femi saw in the mirror and in his son, seemed to judge him from beyond the grave. His father had taught him that power was everything, that emotion was weakness, that a man's legacy was measured in assets, not attachments. He had lived his whole life by that cold, brutal creed. And where had it led him? To this moment. A pariah in his own city, a stranger to his own son, a man who had everything and nothing. He thought of Ngozi, of her quiet strength, her refusal to be bought or broken. She had nothing, yet she possessed a richness of character he could only dream of. She had chosen truth over comfort, dignity over wealth. She had been the better person, the stronger person, at every turn. That evening, Ngozi stood at her window, holding Kamsi and watching the city lights begin to twinkle across the Lagos skyline. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from reporters offering huge sums for her exclusive story, but she ignored them all. This was never about money or fame. It was about one thing only, her son's right to his own truth. She felt a quiet, profound peace settle over her. The storm had passed and she was still standing. Across the water in his silent mansion, Femi finally made a decision. Damage control was useless. Settlements were an insult. There was only one path forward, and it was not the path of a powerful CEO, but the path of a broken man. He picked up the phone, but he didn't call his lawyer. He called his head of PR. "Arrange a press conference for tomorrow morning," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "No restrictions, no pre-approved questions. It's time I told the truth." The press conference was the most anticipated media event of the year. The conference room at the Eco Hotel was packed to capacity, a pulsating sea of cameras, microphones and reporters, all buzzing with a frenzied predatory energy. They had come expecting a performance, a carefully worded statement from a lawyer, a non-apology, a spin. When Chief Femi Adebiyi walked onto the stage alone, without his usual entourage of lawyers and aides, a hush fell over the room. He looked smaller than they remembered, his expensive suit hanging on him as if he had lost weight. The arrogance and unshakable confidence that were his trademarks were gone, replaced by a deep, visible weariness. He walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had spent months dissecting his life. He took a long, slow breath, a man standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump. "Good morning," he began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I will not be taking questions today. I am here to make a statement, to tell the truth. For the past year, I have engaged in a campaign of lies and denial, and for that, I am profoundly sorry." A collective gasp went through the room. This was not the speech they were expecting. "The DNA results have confirmed what I should have known in my heart from the very beginning. The boy, Kamsi Eze, is my son." He said the name clearly, without hesitation, the words a public acknowledgement that changed everything. "My denial was not born of doubt, but of fear. Fear of responsibility, fear of scandal, and the foolish, arrogant pride that has guided my life for far too long. I let that fear turn me into a cruel and callous man. I failed to protect a woman I had wronged, and I denied an innocent child his birthright. There is no excuse for my behaviour. It was shameful, and it was wrong. He then did something no one could have predicted. He looked directly into the main television camera, as if speaking to an audience of one. "To Ngozi," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I failed you. I used you. I dismissed you, and I publicly humiliated you. You showed me a moment of kindness, and I repaid it with cruelty. You have shown nothing but strength, grace, and dignity in the face of my inexcusable actions. I know that sorry is a wholly inadequate word, but it is the only one I have. I am sorry for the pain, the shame, and the struggle I have put you through. You deserved better. You deserved the truth from the start." The room was utterly silent. The reporters, usually so boisterous, were stunned, their pens hovering over their notepads. They had come to witness the downfall of a titan. Instead, they were witnessing the painful public birth of his conscience. He took another shaky breath before continuing. "And to my son, Kamsi," he said, his voice thick with tears. "I am sorry that your first months on this earth were spent with a father who was too much of a coward to claim you. I have missed your first smile, your first laugh. I have robbed myself of those moments, and I have robbed you of a father's presence. I can never get that time back. All I can do is promise this, not just to you, but to the world. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the father you deserve. I will not fail you again." He paused, composing himself. "Effective immediately, I will be stepping back from my role as CEO of Adebiyi Holdings to focus on my personal responsibilities. My only job now is to earn the trust of my son and to begin to repair the damage I have caused." He looked out at the silent room one last time. "That is all. Thank you." And with that, he turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind a storm of his own making, but having finally and publicly chosen his side. In her small room in Surulere, Ngozi watched the entire press conference on a small second-hand television, Kamsi bouncing on her lap. She listened to his words, to the raw, unfiltered pain in his voice, and felt the armor around her own heart begin to crack. The anger she had held on to for so long, the righteous fury that had sustained her, began to recede, replaced by a complex wave of emotions she couldn't name. She saw not the powerful chief who had rejected her, but the broken, lonely man from the study. He had done the one thing she never thought he would do. He had surrendered. He had chosen truth over power, humility over pride. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sadness or even of victory. They were tears of a deep, complicated release. As Femi's face disappeared from the screen, Kamsi reached up and touched her wet cheek with his tiny hand, his luminous amber eyes full of a wisdom beyond his months. The world had finally heard the truth. The battle was over. And a new, uncertain journey was just beginning. Femi's public confession did not magically erase the past, but it changed the air. The reporters and their news vans vanished from outside Ngozi's compound. The whispers and stares from her neighbours were replaced by nods of respect. She was no longer a scandalous mystery, but a woman who had been publicly vindicated. Femi did not try to contact her immediately. He gave her space, a silent acknowledgement that this next chapter had to begin on her terms. A week after the press conference, a simple handwritten letter arrived, delivered by a regular courier, not a corporate driver. It was from Femi. It contained no offers of money, no legal jargon. It was just a few simple, heartfelt sentences. "I know I have no right to ask for anything," he wrote, "but I would like to see my son. Whenever you are ready, if you are ever ready, please let me know. I will wait." The letter was a question, not a demand. It was the first time he had ever truly given her the power. Ngozi read the letter a dozen times. She discussed it with Mama Chioma, who advised caution but acknowledged the change in him. A man who can humble himself like that in front of the whole world is a man who is serious, she said. But the road to forgiveness is long. Walk it at your own pace. Ngozi knew Kamsi deserved to know his father, especially a father who was finally trying to be a man worthy of knowing. After several days of thought, she sent a simple text message back. Sunday 2 p.m. at the park. It was a test. She wanted to see if he would come to her world, on her terms, without the shield of his wealth and status. He replied instantly, "I will be there." That Sunday she dressed Kamsi in his little Ankara outfit and walked to the local park, a small, bustling patch of green in the heart of Surulere. Femi was already there, sitting alone on a bench, looking impossibly out of place in his simple trousers and polo shirt. He looked nervous, vulnerable. When he saw them, a slow, hesitant smile spread across his face. He didn't rush toward them. He waited. Ngozi walked over and sat at the other end of the bench, a cautious distance between them. Kamsi, however, had no such reservations. He let out a squeal of delight and toddled on his unsteady legs directly toward Femi. Femi knelt, his movements still slightly awkward, and opened his arms. Kamsi fell into his embrace, patting his face with his small hands, his laughter pure and uncomplicated. Watching them, Ngozi felt the last of her anger dissolve, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. For the next hour, they didn't talk about the past. They talked about Kamsi. Femi asked about his favourite foods, his nap schedule, the meaning of his babbles. He was not a chief or a CEO. He was just a father, trying to learn the language of his son. He was present, in a way he had never been before. He listened more than he spoke, his eyes full of a quiet reverence for the small, miraculous life he had almost thrown away. This became their new routine. Weekly visits to the park, then quiet evenings at Ngozi's apartment. Femi learned how to change a diaper, how to read a picture book with the right silly voices, how to patiently build a tower of blocks, only to have Kamsi knock it down with a shriek of glee. He was clumsy and inexperienced, but he was trying. He never offered money directly again, but he arranged for a substantial anonymous trust to be set up for Kamsi, managed by an independent third party. He also made a large, quiet donation to Mama Chioma's Market Association, a silent thank you to the women who had been Ngozi's shield. He was learning a new kind of power, the power of quiet support, not of loud control. The story never had a fairy tale ending. They did not get married and move into the Banana Island estate. Life was far more complicated than that. Femi sold the massive empty house and moved into a smaller, more modest one. Ngozi used the child support from the trust to go back to school, determined to build her own future. The story's true ending was not a single event, but a series of small, quiet moments that slowly rebuilt a bridge over a chasm of pain. It was Femi showing up for Kamsi's first birthday, not with an extravagant gift, but with a simple cake he'd bought himself. It was Ngozi finding it in her heart to invite him for a home-cooked meal, their conversation easy and natural for the first time. It was the three of them, walking hand in hand through the market, no longer a scandal but just a family. A complicated, scarred but real family. Redemption, they both learned, was not about erasing the past, but about building a future worthy of its lessons. And love, they discovered, was not found in grand gestures, but in the quiet, daily, stubborn choice to simply show up. And in the luminous, honey-gold eyes of their son, they both found the blessing they never knew they were looking for.